The mother complained about her daughter-in-law to her son, and before he left for a business trip, he decided to install a hidden camera. When he saw the recordings, he was horrified by what he watched. At the moment Esther arrived at the house, she would from then on share with Eduardo, her fiancé, and his mother, Paola. A feeling of discomfort took hold of her, although she tried to hide it with a smile. Eduardo, always attentive, noticed Esther's hesitation and quickly intervened. "Love, I know all this is new for you, especially now that we're close to our wedding, but I promise my mother and I will make you feel at home," he said, trying to ease her worries with a gentle touch on her shoulder. Esther, despite appreciating Eduardo's efforts, still felt a growing restlessness, a premonition that adapting would not be as simple as her fiancé imagined. Paola observed the interaction between Esther and Eduardo from a safe distance. Her smile was polite, but her eyes did not hide a spark of disapproval and jealousy of her son. "Welcome to the family, Esther. I hope you find everything you need here," said Paola, with a voice that carried a weight Esther could not decipher. It was a welcome that sounded more like a warning, and Esther wondered if she would ever truly feel at ease while sharing the house with her mother-in-law, or if this could bring problems for their relationship. In the days that followed, while Eduardo was immersed in his work commitments, Esther tried to adapt to her new life. The house, though beautiful, seemed a maze of unspoken rules and silent expectations, with Paola showing herself to be a good person yet strict. "Esther, we have a specific way of doing things around here. I think it would be better if you let me show you how we take care of our home for now, and then I'll pass some tasks on to you," Paola suggested, her offer sounding more like an imposition. Esther, wanting to avoid conflicts, agreed, although each of Paola's instructions seemed to diminish her autonomy in the new house even further. Eduardo, for his part, was oblivious to Esther's growing discomfort. He saw his mother as a pillar of strength and Esther as the new light of his life, unable to notice the tension between the two. "Esther, are you feeling okay? You seem a bit down lately. You can tell me anything," he asked one day, genuinely concerned, but unaware of the depth of Esther's feelings. "I'm fine, Eduardo. Just adjusting," she replied, forcing a smile, not wanting to worry him or cause a division in the family. On one specific evening, Eduardo announced the trip he would take. "The company called me today, and I have to take a trip to Guadalajara the day after tomorrow to sort out a new contract with an investor, and I will have to stay there for a few days. You'll be fine in my absence, right?" Esther felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She desired some space to breathe, away from Paola's constant gaze, but also feared the loneliness and isolation in her mother-in-law's dominating presence. "Eduardo, I'll miss you, but I think a bit of time alone with your mother might perhaps help us to get to know each other better," Esther said, trying to convince herself as much as him. Eduardo, optimistic, agreed with his fiancée. "That sounds wonderful, love. I'm sure you two will get along well." At the dawn of the day marking Eduardo's departure, the house pulsed with a subtly altered energy, a mix of anticipation and restlessness. Eduardo, amidst his final preparations, did not fail to express his concern for Esther and his trust in his mother to take care of her. "Esther, I've installed cameras at strategic points around the house. I want you to feel safe, especially while I'm away," he explained, detailing the security system's operation with meticulous care. Esther watched, absorbing every word, a mix of gratitude and nervousness reflected in her gaze. Paola was observing the conversation from a distance, her expression inscrutable. When Eduardo turned to her, his tone was pleading, emphasizing the importance of his trust in her. "Mom, please take care of Esther. You know how much she means to me," Eduardo said, the sincerity in his voice evident. Paola nodded, a silent promise between mother and son. "Don't worry, Eduardo. I'll treat Esther as if she were my own daughter," she replied. But the promise seemed to carry a weight that only Esther felt, like the fear of being without her fiancé by her side. In the final moments before his departure, Eduardo and Esther shared a goodbye filled with emotions. "I'll miss you every second," Eduardo confessed, embracing Esther with an intensity that tried to make up for the imminent distance. "Me too, but I'll be waiting for you," Esther responded, trying to infuse each word with optimism. It was a farewell full of unspoken promises, an understanding that the following days would be a test for both of them. Later that day, with Eduardo's departure, the dynamics of the house changed drastically. Paola, who had previously shown herself to be kind and understanding in her son's presence, now revealed her true face. "Esther, I hope you don't mind, but I prefer to cook all the meals from now on. You need to focus on settling into the house and I simply prefer things my way and I don't think you have any problem with that, Paula declared, taking control of the kitchen. Esther, though reluctant, didn't have the energy to protest. Of course, Paula, thank you for helping, she said, trying to hide her apprehension with a weak smile. The day Eduardo left, the dynamics inside the house began to change in a subtle but noticeable way. Eduardo's absence was immediately felt by Esther, who now found herself alone with Paula, the matriarch who until then had maintained a facade of cordiality. Paula's true nature began to reveal itself on the first morning without Eduardo. She entered the kitchen where Esther was trying to prepare her breakfast. "Let me do that, Esther. You're still settling in and I want you to rest," Paula insisted. But her tone was no longer offering, it was commanding. Esther, sensing the change in tone, felt a twinge of anxiety. "I really appreciate your help, Paula, but I'd like to try doing some things on my own. It's important for me to feel useful, I enjoy it," Esther responded, hoping to find some common ground. However, Paula did not yield. "Esther, I insist. You're not in any condition to exert yourself. Besides, Eduardo asked me to take care of everything while he's away. We wouldn't want to disappoint him, would we?" The way Paula invoked Eduardo's name as a weapon of authority made it clear that any attempt at resistance would be futile. As the days passed, Paula began to impose more rules, each limiting Esther's freedom within her own home even further. She determined meal times, rest periods, and even the TV programs that Esther could watch. "Esther, it's for your own good. You need structure to recover properly," Paula explained, but the concern sounded more and more like control. Esther felt her autonomy being stolen more and more, replaced by a strict routine that Paula meticulously orchestrated. One afternoon, while Esther was sitting in the garden trying to read, Paula approached with a tray of tea. "Here, dear, drink this. It'll make you feel better," Paula said, extending the cup. Esther accepted, but her stomach twisted. "Paula, I was thinking maybe I could start taking light walks around the neighborhood. I think the fresh air could do me good and distract my mind," Esther suggested, seeking some way to escape, even if just for brief moments, from the constant surveillance. "Oh, no, Paula quickly rejected the idea. "You're still too weak to go out. We can't risk your health. Besides, I would never forgive myself if something happened to you under my watch." The relationship between Esther and Paula became more tense each day, with Paula constantly criticizing Esther's attempts to participate in household chores or to take any initiative on her own. "Esther, why do you insist on doing these things? I've already told you that I'll take care of everything. You just need to focus on getting better," Paula reprimanded, her words sounding more like orders than advice. Esther, feeling increasingly isolated and powerless, began to question her own perceptions and the reality of her situation. The house, which was supposed to be her sanctuary, had turned into a kind of prison. That morning, as the sun began to cast its first lights over the city, the house seemed strangely quiet, a quietness that preceded the storm. Paula was in the kitchen, her imposing figure dominating the space with unquestionable authority. Esther descended the stairs, the sounds of her steps echoing against the silence, finding Paula already preparing breakfast. "Today I prepared something special for you, Esther. A recipe I learned from my mother, something that will surely help you feel better," Paula announced, without turning to face Esther, who was approaching. Paula's voice was calm, but there was something in it, a certain tension that Esther couldn't ignore. Esther looked at the dish being served. There was something about it that didn't seem right, a mix of colors and aromas that was unfamiliar to her. "Thank you, Paula. It looks really delicious," Esther responded, her voice trembling, betraying all the apprehension she felt. As she picked up the fork, her hand shook slightly, suspicion growing inside her for being with someone she didn't know well. She thought to herself, "What if her food is really bad and I can't eat it? This mix doesn't look very inviting." "I insist that you eat everything, Esther. It's important to get strong and healthy," Paula pressed, finally turning to observe Esther with a look that seemed to measure each reaction. Esther nodded, forcing a smile as she took the first bite. The taste was strange, something bitter that hid under the mix of spices, causing an immediate nausea that Esther struggled to disguise, aiming not to embarrass her mother-in-law or herself. After breakfast, Paula retired to the garden, leaving Esther alone with her thoughts. The house, which was supposed to be her refuge, now felt like a cage. I need to find out what she put in the food, and we have to talk about this. I don't remember being allergic to anything, and I know she's just trying to do her best for me. Eduardo will hate it if he even imagines that I'm not cooperating, Esther thought, determination growing within her. It was an unknown game being played, and Esther knew she needed to be cautious in her next steps. Esther took advantage of Paula's absence to inspect the kitchen, looking for any clue that might explain the discomfort she felt after meals. She searched through cabinets and drawers. Her meticulous search, however, revealed nothing immediately suspicious. Frustrated, she realized she would need a more elaborate plan to uncover the secrets that Paula's poor cooking skills hid and perhaps solve the problem peacefully. Reaching the end of another day under the same roof as Paula, Esther found herself at a crossroads of emotions and suspicions. The living room, bathed in the soft light of dusk, served as the stage for a silent confrontation between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Paula, I was thinking, maybe I should start participating more actively in the household chores, including in the kitchen. After all, I can't depend on you for everything. It's not fair, Esther began, trying to gently introduce the idea of regaining some autonomy. Paula, sitting in her favorite chair, knitting with a precision that reflected years of practice, looked up at Esther. Her penetrating and calculated gaze crossed the room before responding. Dear, your concern is touching but completely unnecessary. You should focus only on adjusting to the new house, and I'm here to ensure that happens. Eduardo entrusted this task to me, and I will not fail him. Meanwhile, you can rest easy. I will take care of all the household chores, Paula replied, each word laden with a finality that left little room for argument. Esther felt frustration grow within her, a mix of anger and helplessness. But Paula, don't you think it would be beneficial for me to familiarize myself if I felt more useful? Sitting around all day is not helping. I need to move, do something productive, Esther insisted, her voice trembling slightly, revealing the tension she struggled to control. Paula set her knitting in her lap, a gesture that preceded the seriousness of her words. Esther, you don't understand. The world out there is full of dangers, and this city isn't the safest to be wandering around alone. My responsibility is to protect you, not to expose you to unnecessary risks. And if something happened, how would I explain that to Eduardo? Paula questioned, using Esther's safety as an argument, a tactic aimed at strengthening her dominant position. The debate between the two women continued, with Esther trying to find flaws in Paula's armor, looking for a breach that would allow her to breathe, to be herself again. I understand your concern, Paula, and I appreciate it. But I need you to also understand that what I need now is movement, to be independent, to become the best woman for your son, through small acts of autonomy that you seem determined to deny me, Esther argued, her determination strengthening with every word despite the fear she felt. Paula sighed, a rare demonstration of patience that preceded her final decision. Esther, I'll think about your request, but for now things will remain as they are. It's late and you should rest. We can resume this conversation tomorrow, maybe, Paula proposed, ending the debate with a note of postponement that left Esther unsure if she had made any progress. That night, Esther lay in her bed, her mind bubbling with confused thoughts and emotions. Despite the apparent stalemate, she felt that something had changed, a slight shift in the power dynamics between her and Paula. It was a glimmer of hope, still small but persistent, encouraging her not to give up. I think maybe we can really understand each other. I just need to learn how to deal with her and be nice, and then we will get closer and become a beautiful family, she told herself before falling asleep. Waking up the next morning, Esther barely had time to process her thoughts before a strong wave of nausea pushed her out of bed, running towards the bathroom. The cold ceramic against her skin was a small consolation as she succumbed to the debilitating sensation, the sound echoing off the walls. In the bathroom, she vomited part of the food she had consumed the day before. Still panting, she washed her face, trying to erase not only the traces of the event that had just occurred, but also the vulnerability it represented. Upon leaving the bathroom, the aromas coming from the kitchen hit her with an almost tangible intensity, making her stomach churn once again. "Breakfast will be ready soon, Esther," announced Paula, innocently unaware of her daughter-in-law's condition, or perhaps choosing to ignore it. Paula's voice, usually a presence that instilled fear and apprehension, now seemed distant, muffled by all the thoughts dominating Esther's mind. It was in this moment of vulnerability that the phone rang, the melody of the device cutting through the morning silence like a beacon of hope from the caller ID. "Eduardo," Esther murmured to herself before answering, trying to compose her voice. "Hi, love, how are you?" Eduardo's voice on the other end was like a haven, bringing with it a sense of normalcy so desperately needed. "Everything's great," she lied, forcing a tone of lightness that didn't reflect her true state. The conversation flowed briefly, with Esther painting an unreal picture of her routine, hiding the cracks that were starting to form in the relationship between her and Paula within the house, hoping to contain them. After hanging up, Esther found herself reflecting on how easily the lies had flowed from her lips. It was a protection, a shield against the worries she knew her true circumstances would bring to Eduardo. "I can't let my fiancé know what's happening here. I'm responsible for making things work between me and my mother-in-law. She's not that bad, just needs to learn to cook better. I think I'll give her some tips." Entering the kitchen, determined not to let her morning start with defeat, Esther decided it was time to act, to reclaim some control over the entire situation in the friendliest way possible. Under one of the cameras Eduardo had installed in the house, Esther began. "Paula, I'd like to help with the household chores, especially in the kitchen. I know you can do everything very well without me, but I believe we can exchange knowledge and grow closer through this," she announced, surprising herself with the kindness in her voice. Paula's reaction was a penetrating look, a silent evaluation that Esther chose to ignore. However, after a moment of reflection, Paula put her wooden spoon down on the counter, seeming to consider Esther's offer more seriously than expected. "Interesting that you want this, Esther. The kitchen is indeed a place where a lot of our family culture is expressed. Perhaps there's something you can learn here from my skills." Paula finally conceded, though her expression still held a trace of reservation. "Let's start with something simple. I don't want you to get overwhelmed." Esther approached, feeling a mix of victory and nervousness. "I'm ready to learn. What are we making?" she asked, watching Paula prepare the ingredients. Paula chose a basic breakfast recipe, scrambled eggs with bacon, something that would serve as a test for Esther's culinary skills, but also as an opportunity to observe how they would interact in this new context, despite disapproving of having a daughter-in-law who would soon marry and spend her life with her son. As they prepared the dish together, Paula began to guide Esther with surprising patience. "See, the secret is in how you cut the meat. Each piece must be the same size to fry evenly." Esther followed the instructions, focused, discovering a new side of Paula that was neither authoritarian nor distant, but instructive and even kind. Or at least that's how it seemed at that moment. The joint activity in the kitchen led to spontaneous conversations about life, a natural exchange that had been absent between them for a long time. Esther listened attentively as Paula shared kitchen tips among stories of Eduardo's childhood, revealing layers of her personality that Esther had never seen. It was as if in that shared space a truce had been established, allowing both to lower their guards momentarily. "When he was little, I remember Eduardo would play with the farm animals like they were his friends. He always treated them very well until we had to sacrifice them to make meals like this. It was a shame, and soon Eduardo would come back to my arms again, and I would console him," Paula recounted with an odd casualness. After finishing the dish, Paula invited Esther to taste the result of their joint effort. "Try it. Let's see how you did." Esther tasted it, surprised by the delicious flavor they had created together. "It's great," she admitted, a sincere smile crossing her face. Paula, on her side, allowed herself a brief smile of satisfaction. "See, you can be a good cook with the right practice. Well done, Esther." After the unexpected and pleasant interaction that morning in the kitchen, Esther decided to take a long shower, allowing herself a moment of relaxation after the accumulated tensions of the previous days. As the hot water ran, easing her muscles and thoughts, Paula acted quietly in the kitchen, taking advantage of Esther's absence to prepare lunch on her own. She moved with an efficiency that only years of practice could offer, each gesture a testament to her familiarity with the space and tasks. When Esther finally appeared, refreshed from the shower, she found the table already set. Lunch served with an impeccable presentation that rivaled dishes from any high-class restaurant. "Paula, you did all this while I was in the shower." "I wanted to help. You could have waited for me," Esther expressed, a touch of disappointment in her voice for the missed opportunity to continue building on that morning's truce. "Don't worry, dear. For this lunch, I wanted to take care of everything so you could rest and take your bath in peace. Besides, I've already eaten. I'll be in the garden and want you to eat well. I'll leave you alone here for a bit," Paula replied, with a smile that in Esther's eyes seemed to carry an unentirely kind meaning. During lunch, Esther tried to focus on the sensations of the moment, on the flavors that Paula had so professionally combined, but a restlessness grew within her, an uncomfortable reminder of the previous discomfort. And as if in a cruel reminder, it didn't take long after lunch, when Paula curiously wasn't around, for the same feeling of nausea to hit her forcefully, forcing her to run to the bathroom, despair coloring each step. Locked in the bathroom, Esther leaned over the cold sink, the reflection in the mirror showing a paleness that betrayed her malaise. The nausea that invaded her was stronger than last time, a whirlwind that seemed to suck away all her energy. It can't just be a coincidence, she thought, the sound of running water from the faucet sounding distant as she tried to wash her face in hopes of dispelling the feeling of weakness. The doubt about the cause of her discomfort consumed her, more and more certain that it wasn't a simple mistake in food preparation. Taking a deep breath, she tried to gather strength, knowing she needed to address the situation with Paula, even if every part of her being would rather just withdraw and forget the incident. Slowly recovering from the discomfort, Esther returned to the table, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "Paula, I felt sick again, right after lunch," Esther began, hesitant, not wanting to accuse but unable to ignore the coincidence. Paula, in turn, furrowed her brow in a show of concern. "Oh dear, that's worrisome. Do you think it was something you ate? Maybe the breakfast you prepared didn't sit well. It might not have been a good idea for us to cook together," Paula suggested, her voice distilling a veiled insinuation that struck Esther like a blow. This subtle accusation, shifting the blame to Esther, left her even more confused and full of apprehensions. "But I barely ate this morning and everything was fine until now. It must have been something that happened after breakfast because bacon and eggs shouldn't have made me this sick," Esther responded, her mind working frantically to piece things together. Paula's insinuation not only hurt her but also planted a seed of doubt about her own actions and abilities. Could it be possible that she had caused her own discomfort? Realizing her genuinely debilitated condition, Paula approached with a still feigned expression of concern, offering to help Esther sit down. "Dear, maybe you just exerted yourself too much this morning in the kitchen. You're not used to it and it could have affected your stomach," Paula suggested, implying that Esther's initiative to cook might be the cause of her discomfort. Esther, amid waves of nausea, tried to process Paula's words, internally questioning whether her own actions had contributed to her state. Paula continued while preparing a suggestion that supposedly would help Esther feel better. "Look, I think it's best if I take care of the kitchen for now. We need to make sure you're eating something that won't make you sick." The offer, though it appeared caring, carried a tone that stripped Esther of any autonomy over her dietary choices, reinforcing Paula's position as the indispensable caretaker, whose actions should not be questioned. Esther, still struggling against the discomfort, had no strength to contest Paula's suggestion. The idea that her brief period in the kitchen could be the cause of her suffering seemed increasingly true in her weakened mind. The doubt about her own capabilities and the dependency on Paula's approval grew within her. However, amidst the discomfort, a spark of resistance ignited within Esther. She recognized the need to assert herself more within the house, not to let isolated incidents define her capabilities or limit her actions in that environment. "Paula, I appreciate your concern, but I think I also need to learn from my mistakes. If indeed it was something I did at breakfast, I want to understand what it was so I don't repeat it," Esther managed to say, her voice weak but determined, marking a small yet significant act of assertiveness. Paula, surprised by Esther's response, couldn't hide a brief puff of respect for her daughter-in-law. "Very well, Esther, if that's your decision, I'll respect it, but please take care of yourself. We wouldn't want Eduardo to worry unnecessarily on his important trip, would we?" Paula's response, while still maintaining her stance of superiority, indicated an opening for a more balanced dialogue, a convenient acknowledgement that Esther had the right to participate more actively in managing her own health and well-being. As dusk approached, Esther armed herself with determination to face the next challenge, preparing dinner on her own and attempt to regain some control and autonomy over her life in that house. "Paula, I was thinking..." Maybe I could prepare dinner tonight by myself. That would be really important to me, Esther said, finding Paula in the living room, who was leafing through an old family recipe book. Paula looked up, surprised by the suggestion. Alone? Are you sure? Not that I doubt your abilities, but... Paula left the sentence hanging, clearly hesitant to relinquish control of the kitchen to her daughter-in-law. For some reason she insisted on hiding. Yes, I'm sure. I think it will be good for me, plus I'd like to surprise you with a dish from my own family, Esther insisted, maintaining a calm and confident tone, trying to mask the anxiety she felt inside. After a moment of silence, in which the ticking of the clock seemed to echo louder than usual, Paula finally nodded. All right, Esther, the kitchen is yours. But if you need anything, I'll be around, and you can ask for my help whenever necessary, as it will be, she said, not without casting a look that mixed curiosity with a hint of doubt regarding Esther's abilities. Once in the kitchen, Esther began preparing dinner, each movement a mix of caution and excitement. Then, while searching for a specific ingredient in the cupboard, her hands found a jar labeled as rat poison. The jar was almost hidden behind some food cans, as if someone had tried to conceal it, but not well enough. For a moment her heart stopped, breath caught in her throat. With the jar still in her hands, Esther confronted Paula. "What is this doing here in the kitchen?" Her voice was firm, though it trembled slightly. Paula, caught off guard, took a second longer to respond. "Oh, it must have been placed there by mistake. You know, with the house being so large, sometimes things end up not being in the right place," Paula explained. But there was a lightness in her voice that wasn't convincing. "By mistake, Paula, this is rat poison. It shouldn't be anywhere near food. It could cause serious harm to someone if ingested by mistake," Esther retorted, suspicion and indignation growing within her. Paula just shrugged, a failed attempt to appear uninterested. "Well, now that you found it, you can put it in the right place. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll get back to my book." Esther stood still for a moment, processing the exchange. The discovery not only made her uncomfortable, but also gave new life to her previous suspicions about Paula's intentions. However, instead of confronting Paula directly, Esther chose a different approach. "I'll put this in a safe place. Maybe she's right and I'm just being a bit paranoid. I'll get back to cooking," she thought to herself. As Esther focused on preparing dinner, she decided she needed a quick break. "Just a minute," she murmured to herself, heading to the bathroom. The kitchen, now immersed in the inviting aromas of the dishes she was preparing, was a testament to her effort to create a special night, despite the challenging circumstances. After a brief moment in the bathroom, Esther returned to the kitchen, expecting to find everything as she had left it. However, the scene before her eyes ignited a spark of anger she didn't know she possessed. Paula, with her back to the entrance, was just adding a jar of some supposed seasoning to the pot in which Esther was preparing dinner. "What do you think you're doing?" Esther's voice sounded louder and firmer than she intended, echoing off the kitchen walls. Paula startled at Esther's voice, turning abruptly, the jar still in her hand. Surprise and fear were evident on her face, a mask of emotions she struggled to control. "Esther, I just wanted to help. I thought the dish needed a bit more flavor," she stammered, her justification sounding weak even to her own ears. "Help? Helping by putting something in my food without asking? That's not help, it's intrusion. That must be why I've been feeling sick lately, not even knowing what I'm ingesting." Esther exploded, frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. Her hands trembled, not just from anger, but from the betrayal that action represented. Paula took a step back, clearly frightened by the intensity of Esther's reaction. "Please don't think ill of me. It was a mistake, I admit. It won't happen again, you can be assured, my dear daughter-in-law." She tried to apologize, but her words seemed inadequate given the circumstances. "A mistake? You call this a mistake? I was looking forward to making this dinner, to prove to myself and to you that I can... And you ruin everything with a mistake," Esther continued, her voice laden with emotion and disappointment. It was more than just the act itself, it was what that act represented about trust and personal space. Paula, now visibly shaken, lowered her gaze. "I'm truly sorry, Esther, I wasn't thinking. Please give me a chance to make it right," she pleaded, offering the jar of seasoning as if it were a white flag. Esther looked at the jar, then at Paula, her chest rising and falling rapidly with each heavy breath. For a moment the silence between them was palpable, charged with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. "I need some time to think. Please leave me alone," Esther finally said, her voice calmer but still quivering with traces of anger. Paula nodded silently, placing the seasoning jar on the counter before leaving the kitchen, leaving Esther alone with her tumultuous thoughts. As the door closed behind Paula, Esther leaned on the counter, trying to process the avalanche of emotions the confrontation had triggered. Dinner, which was supposed to be a moment of celebration and pride, had turned into an emotional battlefield, leaving Esther questioning not just Paula's intentions, but also how they could move forward from this point. With the house now quiet, Esther turned her attention to the seasoning jar Paula had used, driven by a disturbing curiosity. Opening the jar, she expected to find just common spices, but what she saw made her freeze. Inside, mixed with the spices, were grains she didn't recognize, something definitely out of place. Her heart raced as she realized this could be the cause of her recent discomfort. Wait, this looks a lot like that rat poison I found in the kitchen, but could it be? It's not possible. My mother-in-law wouldn't try to poison me. At the peak of that night, after the incident in the kitchen, Esther felt the situation had reached an unsustainable point. She sought out Paula in the living room, determined to resolve things once and for all. "Paula, we need to talk, and it needs to be serious," Esther began, her voice firm, though her heart raced. Paula looked at Esther, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Esther? I'm listening," she responded, trying to maintain an appearance of calm. "What happened today in the kitchen? That was the last straw. I can't and won't tolerate this kind of behavior anymore. You crossed all the boundaries. You gave poison to your own daughter-in-law in her food," Esther declared, staring directly into Paula's eyes. Paula seemed surprised, perhaps not expecting such a direct confrontation. "Esther, I've already apologized for the seasoning, and you heard me. It was a misidentification on my part. You don't need to make all this drama just because of that," she tried to explain, but Esther interrupted. "Apologies are not enough, Paula. It's not just about a specific seasoning or about who cooks dinner. It's about respect, trust, and privacy, and unfortunately, you've shown you respect none of those. You played with someone's life, and it's someone your son loves, Paula," Esther continued, each word heavy with the frustration and disappointment accumulated. There was a moment of silence between them, a heavy silence that filled the space with tension and expectation. Paula finally spoke, her voice low. "So what are you suggesting? I think you better be clear and just say it. I think it's best for everyone if you move out, at least for now. We need space and time to evaluate all that's happening here," Esther said, her decision clear in her voice, even if her heart ached at the idea of sending someone away from their home. Paula looked at Esther, her eyes full of a mix of feigned sadness and understanding. "If that's what you think is necessary, I'll respect your decision. I didn't want it to come to this, but I see that my actions have consequences, even though those actions were very simple and justifiable in my view," she responded, finally acknowledging the gravity of the situation, or a portion of it. Esther felt a bitter relief hearing those words. "Thank you for understanding, Paula. I hope that in time you can realize you can't simply poison your son's girlfriend so he won't get engaged and married," Esther expressed, harboring a small hope for future reconciliation. As Paula began to pack her things, Esther reflected on the tough decision she had just made. Sending Paula away from home was not something done lightly, but it was a necessary step to protect her peace and start rebuilding her life on new terms. Moreover, she was taking care of herself, as Paula had attempted to poison her with rat poison. "I shouldn't have to do this to Paula, but she really crossed very high limits, and I can't allow that here. I won't bother Eduardo with this matter now, but I want her gone," Esther reflected in her own company. A few hours after Paula's departure, Esther's phone rang in an unexpectedly calm moment, with Eduardo's name appearing on the screen. With a heavy heart, she answered, anticipating the storm she was about to face. "Esther, please tell me it's not true. My mother just called me, completely devastated. She said she was kicked out of the house. What happened?" Eduardo's voice was filled with confusion and concern, indicating he was struggling to understand the situation presented by his mother. After a moment of silence from Esther, Eduardo continued, "Esther, we need to talk about this now. I'm trying to understand your point of view, but it's difficult without knowing all the details. My mother is saying one thing, and I feel like you have another version. What exactly happened?" Eduardo pressed, his voice revealing a mix of frustration and a desire to understand what was happening in his absence. She sighed deeply, knowing the conversation would not be easy. Eduardo, believe me when I say this was the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I never wanted things to reach this point, but after everything that happened, I felt I had no choice, Esther explained, her voice trembling with emotion. But to kick out my mother, Esther, do you realize how serious that is? I'm on the other side of the world feeling helpless because I don't know what's happening in my own home. Eduardo's voice rose in volume, not out of anger, but due to the anguish of feeling disconnected from the situation. Esther, I need you to be honest with me. What did my mother do to make you take such drastic action? You know we can talk about anything. Why didn't you wait for me to come back so we could discuss this together? Eduardo's concern was evident, seeking to understand but also to be part of the solution. I know, Eduardo, and I'm sorry for that, but it wasn't something that could wait. Your mother, she crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. It's not just a simple situation that can be solved with a conversation. It's more complicated, Esther responded, choosing her words carefully not to exacerbate the situation, but also to defend her decision until she could explain it in person. Eduardo sighed on the other end, a sound of understanding mixed with the promise of support. All right, Esther, I'll try to book a flight to come back as soon as possible, right after we finish the last meeting of the week. We need to sort this out together, face to face. I trust you, and I know you wouldn't do something like this without a very strong reason. We'll talk more when I arrive. They ended the call with promises to seek a resolution together, leaving Esther with her thoughts. She knew the conversation with Eduardo would be one of the most challenging moments of her life, but she was determined to explain her reasons, hoping to find a way to move forward together. He will understand, he has to. I really tried to befriend her, but it didn't work. I thought I was the mistake, but she was trying to get me out of her son's life. Esther reflected. 2 days after the call, Eduardo finally arrived home after a long and exhausting flight. The tension from the previous conversation with Esther still weighing on his mind. Upon seeing her, the seriousness in his gaze indicated he was ready to uncover the truth behind the conflicting claims. Esther, we need to clarify what happened while I was away. You mentioned things got complicated with my mother, but I need to see for myself to understand, Eduardo began, striving to maintain a calm approach despite the anxiety he felt. Esther, recognizing Eduardo's determination, agreed, albeit reluctantly. I understand, Eduardo. I know all this seems confusing and you have every right to want to uncover the truth, she replied, her voice low but firm. But before, I'd like you to know that every decision I made was with the best interest for both of us in mind, even if it seems otherwise now. Eduardo then turned to the security system he had installed in the house, a precautionary measure he never imagined he'd need to use to clarify a domestic conflict. I'll check the cameras. If there's something I need to know, it's better to find out sooner, he said, a heavy heart as he typed the access password to the recording archive. As the images began to display on the computer screen, both remained silent, Esther closely watching Eduardo's reaction. The recordings showed trivial day-to-day moments, until Eduardo paused on a specific scene, his expression turning from confusion to alarm. What? This can't be true, he murmured, disbelief coloring his voice. In the camera image, Eduardo's mother was seen adding rat poison to the food she was preparing, then handing it over to Esther after adding many spices to slightly mask the taste. Esther, by his side, felt a whirlwind of emotions. Eduardo, what you saw, I can explain, she began, interrupted by Eduardo, who raised his hand asking for immediate silence in light of everything he was seeing through the security camera recordings. My mother was trying to... Esther, this changes everything. How could this have really happened here? How and why? Eduardo finally said, after a moment of deep reflection. The recording didn't show Esther committing an act of betrayal, but rather a completely different situation that defied the accusations previously made. Esther took the opportunity to express herself. Eduardo, from the beginning, all I wanted was to protect our home, our life together. There was a misunderstanding, a mistaken perception of my actions, she explained, her words laden with sincerity. Eduardo, now with a clearer understanding of the situation, looked at Esther, a glimpse of relief in his eyes. Esther, I believe you. We'll sort this out together, clear up the misunderstandings and ensure nothing shakes our trust again, not even my mother. We should confront her for the sake of our freedom. I'm going to call my mother right now, he proposed, grabbing his phone to dial the number. Paula answered, the initial silence broken by her hesitant breathing on the other end of the line. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened." "I can't understand why you did this," Eduardo said, his voice trembling, mixing frustration with the search for answers. There was a pause, a deep sigh before his mother began to speak, her voice laden with raw emotion. "Eduardo, my son, I was just trying to protect our bond. I saw how close you were getting to Esther, and the fear of losing you to her consumed me. I didn't want someone to steal you from me. We've always been so close," she confessed, her words sounding more like a lament than a justification. With a heavy feeling and without finding words that could express his disappointment and pain, Eduardo abruptly hung up the phone, letting the silence speak for itself. A day later, in the quiet of their own home, Eduardo faced one of the hardest decisions of his life. After checking the security cameras again, an unexpected and painful truth emerged within him, forcing him to face a reality he had never imagined. The evidence before his eyes was undeniable, a silent testimony to acts that went beyond the bounds of trust and familial love. With a heavy heart, Eduardo knew what he had to do, but the decision to report his own mother to the police came with deep pain, a sense of betrayal to bonds he believed were unbreakable. "How did we get to this point, Mum?" he wondered, his internal voice echoing in the solitude of his thoughts. Standing up, Eduardo walked to the phone, each step heavy with the gravity of his decision. Dialing the police number felt surreal, a line that once crossed would change everything forever. "This is for the greater good, something bigger than jealousy or a lack of compassion for others," he murmured to himself, trying to find some consolation in his rationale, even knowing the consequences of his action would extend for a long time. As he reported the situation to the authorities, Eduardo's voice trembled, not just from nervousness but also from the emotion of revealing such a personal truth to strangers. "My mother was putting rat poison in my fiancé's food with the intention of getting her out of the way at all costs. I want you to do something about this." After the call, Eduardo sat down, enveloped in profound silence. The decision was made. There was no turning back. He knew he would face difficult days ahead, dealing with the repercussions of his actions not only within his family but also in his own sense of justice and loyalty. "How could my own mother dare to do this to my fiancé? It's really shocking." Time passed, bringing significant changes to Eduardo and Esther's lives. They finally celebrated their wedding, an event symbolizing not just the union of their lives, but also the overcoming of the adversities they faced together. The wedding was an intimate ceremony with only a few family members present, filled with hope and forward-looking glances, marking a new chapter in their lives, one where love and mutual understanding were the foundations on which they intended to build their future. Paola, on the other hand, found herself on a more solitary path. Her time in prison was a period of intense personal reflection. Facing the consequences of her actions, Paola dedicated herself to understanding the mistakes she made and seeking ways to redeem herself. Although the days were long and often marked by loneliness, she clung to the hope of one day rebuilding the ties that had been damaged by her decisions. Eduardo and Esther, though deeply affected by past events, chose not to let the shadows of those times dictate the course of their lives. They supported each other, finding strength in shared vulnerability and a renewed commitment to protect and nurture the love they shared. You've reached the end of another gripping narrative on our channel. We invite you to subscribe and leave your like on our video, as it helps us grow and continue publishing new stories almost daily. See you in the next amazing tale.